The stage was set for a high-stakes international debate, live-streamed from a global policy summit in Geneva. On one side stood J.D. Vance, sharp-suited, smooth-talking, and brimming with the confidence of American exceptionalism. On the other, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stoic, sharp-eyed, and wrapped in the dignified silence of a man who had seen his people bleed for freedom. The moderator opened with a question about global alliances and sovereignty. J.D. Vance leaned into the microphone, his voice calm but heavy with warning. In this new world order, he said, nations must understand that submitting to power is not weakness. It is survival. Gasps rippled through the audience. The room was silent, all eyes turning to Traoré. The captain adjusted his collar, stood firm, and without raising his voice, delivered the blow. "We bow to none," he said. The statement hit like thunder. No flourish, no grandstanding. Just a flat, defiant truth, the kind spoken only by men who have led revolutions and buried the consequences. Vance raised an eyebrow, visibly rattled. "Then you risk isolation. You risk destruction." Traoré didn't flinch. "You mistake obedience for peace. We've had both forced upon us before, through your weapons, your banks, and your silence." The tension was palpable. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the storm beneath Vance's polished exterior and the calm fire in Traoré's stare. The clash wasn't just philosophical, it was personal. A war of legacies, of ideologies, of history, and this was just the beginning. As the crowd buzzed from Traoré's fierce defiance, a hush suddenly fell. The room dimmed slightly, and the screens behind the stage lit up, images of Africa's colonial past fading in and out, chains, whips, exploited mines, stolen gold, red rivers. This wasn't part of the official summit agenda. Traoré turned to the display but didn't flinch. "You speak of submission, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice calm but slicing through the silence, "but my people remember what submission looked like. It wasn't peace, it was plunder." J.D. Vance attempted to pivot. "That's history," he said with a performative shrug. "We're offering partnerships, not domination." Traoré chuckled under his breath. "Your partnerships come with clause and contracts that strip the land bare. Every deal signed with your hand has another behind the curtain." "You assume too much," Vance said. "No," Traoré interrupted. "I've seen too much." He began to recount a personal story, one not shared before. As a young soldier, Traoré had stood watch outside a foreign-funded gold mine in Burkina Faso. His orders were to protect it, but inside the fence, his people worked like shadows, underpaid, unseen, sometimes buried alive in collapsed tunnels while Western executives dined in AC-cooled compounds. "I was told I was protecting an investment," Traoré said, turning to the cameras. "What I was really guarding was a theft." The audience was frozen, the tension rippling through every row. Vance looked down for a moment, but he wasn't done. "If you reject power," he said, "you'll only inherit chaos." Traoré stared directly at him, eyes steady. "Then we will build from chaos, but we will never kneel for comfort." The room erupted in applause, not from every corner, but from enough. The war of words had become something far deeper, a battle for narrative. A battle for the future. The studio lights dimmed once again, this time not by design, but as a symbolic shadow cast over the debate. The room felt heavier, like everyone present could sense they were witnessing a turning point. J.D. Vance, trying to claw back control of the moment, leaned into the microphone. "You talk of sovereignty, Captain," he said, forcing a grin. "But without structure, without alliance with global leadership, you're isolating yourself. That's not power, that's suicide." Traoré's jaw clenched slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. "We are not afraid to be alone," he responded. "We've been alone for centuries, while the world came to take, not to give. But from isolation, we forged resilience. Now, we will forge destiny." Vance raised a brow. "So you'd rather burn bridges?" "No," Traoré replied sharply. "I'm just tired of walking across bridges built on our backs." The audience buzzed again, gasps, murmurs, shifting in seats. The tension had evolved. This wasn't just a clash of ideology, it was a reckoning. J.D. Vance tried to appeal to the economic angle. "Africa needs capital," he said, voice now more tempered. You reject our aid, our infrastructure investments, our military partnerships. What do you expect to gain? Traoré paused for effect. Self-respect, he said, and once we reclaim that, everything else follows. Then he pulled out a single photo, black and white, grainy, a child, barefoot, standing in a gold mine, dwarfed by machinery and Western boots. This is what your investments look like, he said, holding it to the cameras. This is what we refuse. The room fell into dead silence. J.D. Vance sat back, arms crossed. He had no counter. Not now, not here. Traoré leaned forward, voice now low, firm. We may not have your missiles or your banks, but we have memory, we have spirit, and we have nothing left to lose, except our chains. A pause, and then applause, roaring, echoing. Some stood. Some just watched, but none could deny it. The man from Burkina Faso had just shifted the global stage with words alone. The silence that followed Traoré's declaration wasn't mere quiet, it was pressure. J.D. Vance glanced around, clearly trying to gauge if the tide had fully turned against him, or if he still had room to steer the narrative. He leaned forward, fixing his eyes on Traoré with a thin smile. You talk about chains, Vance said. But tell me, who built the roads your people use? Who provides the medicine, the trade deals, the satellite systems? If we're colonizers, we're also the ones holding the scaffolding together. Traoré didn't even blink. Scaffolding built to cage us, he said. Not to lift us. The tension turned electric. Our roads cracked beneath stolen weight, Traoré continued. Your medicine comes with strings. Your trade deals write Africa out of its own future. And as for satellites, we don't need surveillance disguised as support. Vance opened his mouth, but Traoré cut him off. J.D., he said, using the first name deliberately, with calm authority, Africa isn't asking for charity. We're demanding fairness. There's a difference. One assumes weakness. The other assumes worth. The host, clearly rattled by the raw emotion and moral weight of the exchange, tried to redirect. Gentlemen, perhaps we should move to economic opportunities. But Traoré wasn't done. Every time we are told to submit to power, that power masks fear. Fear that if Africa rises, others will lose control. But we were never yours to control. Now the studio audience was no longer passive. Phones were recording. Hashtags were already forming. Newsrooms were preparing headlines. Even those who disagreed with Traoré were leaning in, captivated by the weight of every word. J.D. Vance attempted one final jab. And when the lights go out, when the loans stop, when the alliances crumble? Traoré simply smiled. Then we rebuild, brick by brick, on our terms. A moment passed, and then thunderous applause erupted, more than before. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a declaration. The studio lights dimmed for a moment, whether by design or a flicker of tension in the building, no one could tell. But the symbolism was powerful. J.D. Vance had spoken with the confidence of someone raised on certainty. Traoré, however, was speaking from a different kind of fire, one forged in resistance. You think fear is power? Traoré repeated, leaning in. Then you've never faced people who have already lost everything. You can't scare a man who has stood in the ashes of his homeland and still raised his fist. Vance smirked. Emotion is not a strategy, and neither is defiance. Power, real power, is about leverage. And we have it. Traoré didn't blink. You call it leverage. We call it chains. There was a stir in the audience. The comparison hit hard, too close to a truth that some wished to forget. You talk about building nations, Traoré continued. But what you built from our bones. What you control, you took through silence, not consent. Vance interjected. That's the past. Let's talk about now. Then let's, Traoré said. Now, you threaten. You sanction. You destabilize. And you do it wrapped in language like freedom, stability, cooperation. But beneath it all is fear, your fear. That will wake up. That will stop bowing. That will become the authors of our own story. There was a long pause. Vance adjusted his mic, but said nothing. Then Traoré delivered the line that would become the clip viewed around the world. You shout to remind us you're strong. But a lion doesn't roar when it sees a rabbit, it roars when it sees another lion. The audience fell completely silent. No gasps. No murmurs. Just stillness. And then, a single clap. Then another. Until the entire room was erupting in applause. Vance looked stunned, not by Traoré's words alone, but by the realization that something irreversible had happened. The mask of superiority had cracked. The next segment was meant to pivot into a lighter tone, policy talk, mutual goals, economic cooperation. But after the thunderclap of Traoré's last statement, the stage felt like contested ground. Neither man moved. The audience sensed it too, something deeper had begun. J.D. Vance leaned forward. You speak of lions. But let me ask, do your people want war? Do they want isolation? Do they want their leader trading dignity for defiance? Traoré gave a quiet laugh. Is that what you call it? When a man chooses dignity over dependence, you call it isolation? He turned to the camera, his words no longer directed just at Vance, but at millions watching from screens across the globe. They've been told, bow, and you will be fed. But what they got were crumbs. And now, when they choose to grow their own bread, you panic. Vance was visibly uncomfortable. No one is panicking. We are concerned, because when you break ties with allies, you break the systems that sustain peace. Peace? Traoré asked. Peace is not the silence after submission. Peace is the sound of justice being done. And what you call systems, we call cages. The room froze again. Even the moderator didn't dare interrupt. For a moment, all the trappings of media, diplomacy, and rhetoric fell away. What remained was raw truth, and two worldviews colliding. You still don't understand, Traoré said, lowering his voice. You think power is what you hold. But the moment people stop fearing you, that's when power slips. That's when the ground shifts. He leaned back, letting the echo of his words fill the silence. You call this a world order. But we're not asking for a seat at your table anymore. We're building our own. J.D. Vance stared at him. No comeback. No pivot. Just the realization that this wasn't just a debate, it was a warning. And the world was watching. The audience was holding its breath. J.D. Vance had underestimated Traoré, not just the man, but what he represented, a continent standing up after centuries of being pushed down. The moderator cautiously stepped in. President Traoré, how do you respond to concerns that your defiance may lead to greater instability in Africa? Traoré didn't flinch. Instability, he echoed. There is nothing more unstable than a nation built on borrowed will. You talk of concern, where was your concern when our minerals built your machines, when our sweat fueled your empires, when your silence buried our voices? J.D. Vance attempted to interrupt. You're simplifying. No, Traoré cut in sharply, you're complicating the truth. You built your stability on our silence. And now, we're speaking. The crowd murmured. Some nodded. Others looked stunned. But none looked away. Traoré leaned forward, eyes locked on the camera again. You want to know why I won't kneel? Because I come from a people who were forced to kneel for too long. And when they rose, they didn't rise for revenge. They rose for dignity. Vance's smile faded. You think fear is power. But fear is a leash. And I refuse to be leashed. There was something electric in the room. Even the lights seemed brighter, as if the truth being spoken cast a glow of its own. You cannot crush a people who have learned to stand without permission, Traoré continued. You can't suppress a voice that echoes from the ancestors who endured worse. And you will not define freedom for a land you never understood. Vance sat back, silent now. Traoré ended with a final blow. You say you bring order. But you fear the moment we bring our own. J.D. Vance, still seated, now clutched his pen like a weapon he'd forgotten how to use. Traoré stood tall, not just as a president, but as a symbol, a challenge to everything the West believed it had tamed. You speak of power as if it's your inheritance, Traoré began, his voice low but steady. But what you call power, we call theft wrapped in ceremony. Vance raised an eyebrow. America helped build the global system. We maintain peace. Peace? Traoré scoffed. Your peace is our unrest. Your order is our chaos. When our children starve so your stock markets rise, that is not peace. That is polished violence. The room tightened with tension. Even the moderator didn't dare speak now. You believe your institutions are sacred, Traoré continued. But sacred to whom? To the banker in New York? To the CEO in Silicon Valley? What about the miner in Congo, whose life is spent carving out the devices you tweet from? He turned toward Vance again. Do you know what true fear looks like? It's not an armed African, it's a conscious one. One who sees past your flags, your charities, your partnerships. One who realizes he doesn't need you. Vance attempted to speak but couldn't find a foothold. You don't fear war, Traoré added. You fear a world where Africa no longer asks permission. Where we don't wait for funding, we fund ourselves. Where our worth isn't calculated by how useful we are to you. He leaned in, eyes sharp. And that world is coming. You can either accept it, or be left behind, still shouting about power, while the world moves without you. The studio was silent. Even the cameras seemed hesitant to keep rolling. And somewhere, in the homes of millions watching, something shifted. The show had moved to commercial, but the tension lingered like smoke. J.D. Vance sat quietly, while Traoré remained upright, eyes locked on something far beyond the studio walls. Cameras were off, but every person in the room still felt watched, by history, by consequence. You know, Vance finally said, your confidence is impressive, but reckless. You're playing a dangerous game. Traoré didn't even blink. No. I'm ending one. You think walking away from us, our trade, our military aid, our diplomacy, makes you stronger? It makes us honest, Traoré replied. And I'd rather be poor and proud than rich and owned. You really believe Africa can isolate itself and survive? Traoré leaned closer. Africa isn't isolating. Africa is cleansing. Vance frowned. That sounds like revolution. It is, Traoré said flatly. And revolutions don't ask permission. He paused, scanning the crew behind the cameras. Your world, he said, addressing more than just Vance, is a fortress built on silence. Silence of our fathers who died in your mines. Silence of mothers who gave birth beside oil rigs. Silence of nations forced to dance to drums they didn't beat. He faced Vance again. That silence is over. Vance tried to soften his tone. But there's a global order. A structure we've all agreed to. Traoré smiled, not kindly. A structure you built. A structure designed to crown you and chain us. You're making this too personal, Vance warned. It is personal, Traoré said. It's personal to every child who grows up believing wealth is white. It's personal to every farmer displaced by your companies. Every vote dismissed as unstable democracy. Every time you call us corrupt while laundering your billions through our banks. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. And then Traoré whispered something not into the mic, but straight to Vance. We're not afraid of losing your favor. We're afraid of forgetting our worth. And just like that, the final wall between them crumbled, not with a shout, but with truth. After the broadcast ended, the clips had already started circulating online. TikTok, X, Instagram, every second of the confrontation between J.D. Vance and Captain Ibrahim Traoré was dissected, analyzed, memed, and quoted. But one line dominated them all. "Fear you? Spineless one." It wasn't just a retort, it was a cultural earthquake. Across college campuses, young Africans abroad quoted Traoré in student forums. On the streets of Ouagadougou, murals of him with those words appeared overnight. Even in the halls of Western institutions, whispers echoed, "Who is this man who speaks like thunder but never raises his voice?" In a quiet moment, a journalist asked Traoré during a follow-up interview, "Do you regret using such harsh language?" Traoré paused. "I regret every year we didn't speak this way," he said. The room stilled. "Respect," he continued, "was demanded from us long before it was earned by you. And fear was sold to us as wisdom. But when the lion wakes, it does not apologize for its roar." The interviewer tried to shift tone. "What do you say to critics who claim you're provoking Western powers unnecessarily?" Traoré smiled faintly. "Provocation is when a slave demands his name back." A silence lingered. Not awkward, but monumental. J.D. Vance, watching from a distant screen, prepared for his next public statement. Advisors urged him to strike back, reclaim the narrative. But inside, a quiet panic grew, not at Traoré's words, but at their resonance. In another time, leaders like Traoré were dismissed as fringe, too radical, too idealistic. But now, he was becoming something else. A symbol. A spark. And sparks, when ignored, become fire.